Hello, friends, and welcome to Worldbuild with Us, the podcast where we create fantastical worlds with help from you, our listeners. My name is Rob Hilferty, and I'm here with my co-hosts Daniel Quinn and Courtney Staples. On today's episode, we have, for the third time, we've got Justin Alexander from the Alexandrian. But before we roll into that, remember that if you want us to build your world, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com, where you can click the link, follow the instructions, and within a reasonable amount of time, we'll be building your world. If you want to follow us on social media, we're on YouTube over at Worldbuild with Us, and you can follow us on Twitter for some reason at Let's Worldbuild. We've also got a Discord, and if you're feeling particularly generous or just want access to our sweet, sweet patron-only episodes, along with all sorts of other patron-exclusive goodies, then you can go to our Patreon and support us and the podcast there. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's go and jump right into the interview. Hello, friends. Today we are joined once again, the first three-peat from a non-regular guest. We are joined today by Justin Alexander of the Alexandrian. So glad of you to join us once more. Justin, why are you here today? Everyone knows you at this point from the previous episodes. So explain to us, what brings you on today? What are we talking about?
Well, the biggest thing is I just like hanging out with all of you. But the second,
I'll take it.
the second biggest reason is that I have a book coming out this fall called "So You Want to Be a Game Master" from Macmillan and Page Street Publishing, and I am very excited to let everybody know what this book is all about.
From minute one of hearing about this, Daniel and I especially were incredibly excited. I know that I cite you as one of the people that I look to for GMing advice, for gaming advice, and oftentimes for fiction advice in general. I know that I turned Daniel on to the Alexandrian at some point, and he deep dove into it. So this is great news for everyone, but us specifically. I can assure you of that.
There's only two people that I know of online that I'll just say if they produce something, I'm like, just take my money. It would be Tim Rogers and Justin Alexander.
Thank you so much. It's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, no, like any opportunity to support you is very much in our wheelhouse. So tell us all about the book. Like, what prompted you to make a book about game mastering? I mean, it's in your wheelhouse anyway, but why now, and what's the deal with this book in particular?
Well, as you know, I am passionate about sharing game mastering with the world. I think that game mastering often gets this rep of being this very difficult thing to do, this huge commitment. And the reality is, I think that it's actually a lot easier to be a game master than that sort of popular myth would lead you to believe. And I think it's incredibly rewarding creatively to explore worlds that way with a group of people and to enable a group of people to collectively explore worlds in that way. And I just want people to be able to first take the leap and run their games. And then at the same time, I also want to help them run the best game that they can. This particular book, this So You Want to Be a Game Master, is a project I've been hoping to work on and has been kind of noodling around for about 6 or 7 years now. When I first started my Patreon for the Alexandrian, I actually set as one of the stretch goals over there that I would be working on this project. So You Want to Be a Game Master. And when we reached that level, I began kind of working on the project and discovered it was a very big project. And I ended up with a lot of other things going on. I got hired by Modifius to be the line developer and co-designer of the Infinity role-playing game. I got hired by Atlas to become the RPG developer there. And so the book just kind of mulled along in the bottom. But then I got very lucky, which is that Page Street Publishing actually reached out to me and said, "Hey, do you have a book about GMing?" And I said, "Do I ever?" And so really, like, everyone can really thank Page Street Publishing for coming in and motivating me and giving me the opportunity to be able to focus on the book long enough to finish it, because it's a big boy. The book is actually going to be 544 pages, which was shocking to me when they actually brought it back from layout. I was like, oh, I think partly because I've gotten used to thinking in terms of like RPG manual page counts compared to book counts. But this is going to be a trade paperback size because it's being distributed through Macmillan. So it's going to be, if you're looking for the book, it will be found in Barnes & Noble and Amazon and your local bookstore. It'll be in all the places where you can find mainstream books, which is also really exciting to be able to kind of reach out in that way.
Can't wait.
But the idea behind the project was I basically said, or I felt that the GMing book that I wanted when I was 10 years old and becoming a game master for the first time still didn't really exist. And that's the book I wanted to create. And sort of the belief there is that the way to become a game master is that it's actually very simple, and there's a very simple step-by-step procedure that you can follow to do that. And that's what this book sets out to do, is to show you not just GMing advice, but the step-by-step procedure of do this, and then run your game, and you're a game master now. And then the book also takes the next step, which is, I think, also a lot of GMing advice books offer you a lot of really great advice. I have a bunch of really fantastic GMing advice books on my bookshelf right now, but a lot of those books are either general tips and tricks, which are great, or they show you how to run a dungeon, and then they kind of stop there. And what I wanted to do with this book was not just show you those first few steps that get you into an adventure and running the game. I wanted to also give you the tools to create a lot of different adventures. So this book doesn't just show you how to run a dungeon. It also shows you how to run mysteries and node-based scenarios and raids and heists and urban crawls and faction-based play and hex crawls and point crawls. So there's all these different ways of making adventures, and the book is going to give you everything you need to do all of those. So I'm not sure I actually managed to answer your question in that gush about the book.
I feel like that's pretty adequate. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as somebody who really enjoys concrete steps, I appreciate that that's the route you took with this book. And as someone who has actually never GM'd before, I'm curious, like what sorts of advice do you give other than, it's not as hard as it seems? What would you say to somebody who's maybe anxious or nervous about GMing their first game?
Yeah, what's that onboarding process look like?
Yeah, so the way the book opens up is the first thing I do is there's a short introduction, and that is aimed at anyone who's picked up this book in a Barnes & Noble, in a local bookstore, and is like, I have no idea what role-playing is, but this looks interesting. And so that is like a very short introduction of like, what is a role-playing game? And the approach I take with that specifically is mostly a transcript of play. Actually adapted from an actual session that I ran. And as I show you the GM and the players interacting with each other, I'm also commenting about what the GM is doing at each step. So like, here the GM is making a ruling. Here the GM is thinking about this. So it's both a way of introducing the concept of role-playing, but also introducing the concepts of, what is the GM actually doing at the table? What's going on behind that screen over there? And showing that it's not super complicated. It's a few simple ideas being moved around. So there's this introduction, but then we get into the actual onboarding process. And basically the goal there is in about 25 to 30 pages, I want to show the GM, the new GM, these are the skills that you need. And then I give them a adventure that they can actually go and run. And so the two basic steps that I do for this onboarding process is step one is I show you how to make a ruling at the table. And then step two is I show you how to run a room in a dungeon. And if you know how to do those two things, and also the rules of whatever role-playing game you've chosen to play, then you can run your first dungeon. And then that's what the scenario is at that point, is your first dungeon. It's a small 10-room dungeon that they can pick up, go to the table. And I actually tell them in the book, I'm like, go put this book down now. You have everything you need. Go run that adventure and then come back here and we'll talk about what happened there and we'll take the next steps forward from there. But that's the onboarding process. You need the rules of the game, whatever game it is you're playing. You need to know how to make a ruling and you need to know how to run a room. And if you've got those three things, then you can run your first adventure.
So it sounds like you've got a model that basically sets up the first ones free, because to me, right, like once you GM once and once you have that moment, right, like I've talked about on the podcast how I had one particular moment that like hooked me on GMing forever. And it was watching my players crit on a final boss encounter, which had real consequences and stakes to it. and just watching everyone at the table like cheer and like light up at the roll of this die. Real quick aside, Justin, do you have any moments like that? Do you remember when you were playing and for the first time you're like, oh, this is what I want to do. I want to GM more or all the time.
That's a great question. It's been a long, long time since my early days. I will say I was passionate about role-playing games before I'd even seen a role-playing game for the first time. I played my first role-playing game in 1989. And at that time, there was just kind of role-playing games in the air. You would look at TSR would run advertisements for D&D and Marvel Comics, so you'd see advertisements for the game in there. It had shown up in ET. The kids are playing D&D in that. There's a few other places I saw it here and there. So this idea that like people get together and there's somebody who like describes the world and that other people take actions. I knew that, and I thought at 10 years old, I was like, that sounds really cool, and I want to do that. But the internet didn't really exist yet. And so it wasn't like I could go online and Google, like, what is D&D? Show me an actual play of Matthew Mercer and Brennan Lee Mulligan being awesome. Like, that didn't exist. So I spent a long time, like, floating around trying to, like, well, how do I actually get into this as a 10-year-old, in 1989? And what eventually happened was I was at a comic book convention, and I was flipping through a box of back issues, and there was a copy of the 1989 Batman role-playing game from Mayfair that had been released as a tie-in with the Tim Burton movie. And I was like, oh my goodness, I've been looking for a role-playing game. And so the first role-playing game I actually bought and read was the Batman role-playing game from Mayfair. And that didn't make any sense to me at all, because like a lot of role-playing rule books, they didn't actually tell you how to play the game. Like there was a bunch like, here's the rules for skills in this, but like there was no explanation of like, what is the thing you actually do at the table? And that was what I was looking for. And so I remember the first role-playing game I actually played was a Batman game, but it wasn't that one. I ended up being like, I don't understand these mechanics, but I understand how this is supposed to work. So I ended up homebrewing a Batman game that I played with my brother. And so my brother was playing Batman, I was the GM. And the mechanics I came up with was every time Batman tries to do something, I will roll a d6 and you will roll a d6 as Batman. And if I roll higher than you, then Batman fails. And if you roll higher than me, Batman succeeds. That game didn't last very long. That game ended when Batman saw the bat signal and was driving to Gotham. And I was like, driving to Gotham, he's doing a thing. You roll a d6, I roll a d6, and I roll higher. And Batman crashed the Batmobile in a ditch on its way to Gotham City. And I was like, I don't think this is how this is supposed to work. This game needs playtesting is important, but we've got to do a little bit more to develop this particular one. So that's my earliest memory of gaming. So I don't really have like necessarily what that first moment was, but I do know that I was always trying to figure this one out. And maybe this book is the ultimate expression of figuring it out, or at least as much as I've managed to figure out so far.
I mean, thinking of the material like in the book, I'm thinking back to like reading through your articles, right? Praying for the day that we'd have this book. I'm thinking about the hurdles I was trying to overcome as I read more in your articles and realized, oh, that's how you deal with this context. That's how you deal with the situation. For you, if you think back on like the early days of, GMing, the Batman days, was there a hurdle that you felt like you had to overcome? And then once you understood how to do it, your GMing just got a lot easier. Like for me, I feel like it was being comfortable delivering language in the voice of the NPCs without any sort of reference. And then once I was able to inhabit that, things became easier. Like for you, was there something like that where it just took a while to find the right technique? And then of course, I'm sure that's somewhere in your text now.
Yeah. So the biggest hurdle I had as a young GM was figuring out how not to railroad. And it was an interesting process from the inside, because my motivation for role playing was like, it's so exciting to be at the table playing with these people and sharing this world, but I lacked any technique to do that. And so there's actually this isn't role playing specifically, but in 6th grade, we did mock trial in 6th grade. And I remember there was a time when I was selected to be the lead attorney for one of the cases, and I was trying to figure out how to like prep the case, and I couldn't. And so the method I came up with was to like write lengthy scripts of how the questioning on the stand should go, and then it took forever. and was not effective because I was asking people to like memorize things, and like some of the witnesses weren't on my side, but I was still writing these scripts to try to like figure out like, oh, if they say this, then I'll say this. And that was mock trial, but a lot of that also transferred into my early experiences at the table with a role-playing game, because I wanted these big epic experiences. I wanted these big epic stories, but I didn't understand how to actually prep that material. And so that sort of like biggest hurdle for me, and it took a while to get there, honestly, was figuring out how to stop prepping what the players are going to do and start prepping the things I'm going to play with. And it took me even longer to like put it into words in that way. But that's the big mental shift that it took for me to really begin running the games I wanted to run. And you see this a lot in like published adventures, right? A lot of published adventures, if you actually look at what the words on the page are, the words on the page are describing the things that the PCs are going to do. And that is a very difficult place to come from in terms of prepping and also running a game, because you are trying to guess or anticipate or force the players to take the actions that you've anticipated, or you're trying to anticipate everything that they're doing and having a contingency plan for everything that they're doing. And that's just a very difficult and ultimately in many ways impossible thing to do. And so really getting to that mindset more about, I'm going to prep things and play with them at the table with my players. My players will have their characters, they'll play those, and I'll have my NPCs and my factions and my world, and I'll play with that, and we'll play together at the table. That mental shift and figuring out how to do that mental shift was really a big breakthrough for me.
As a corollary to that, then, like, do you see advice being given that's similar, where they're telling GMs to do something that's actually harmful?
I mean, you do see that. Well, I mean, like there are very few things that I'm a naysayer for. There are very few things that people do that I'm like, oh, you're having bad, wrong fun. You shouldn't do that. You should do it a different way. I'm a big fan of like, there are lots of different ways to do things. And the question is, what is the best tool for what you're trying to accomplish right now? But there are a few exceptions. One is like, you can't punch a player in the face. Not the player, okay, you can't punch an actual player in the face, right? Like there are things that are not okay. And then like on that list as well, somewhat lower than punching people in the face of the table, is railroading, forcing the players to do things that they don't want to do, and also doing things as a game master to negate the choices that the players are making at the table and forcing them to make the choices that you want them to make or that you predetermined that they should make. And that's one of the few things in terms of actually like playing the game that I say, no, you're doing it wrong, because the whole point of getting together a group of people and experiencing this role-playing game together is to play together, is to explore this. I want you put together this scenario to see what the players are going to do with it. And if you're just forcing the players to do what you predetermined, I mean, the saying often is like, well, you should just go write a novel. And there's truth to that. And like, I write short stories, I write short fiction, and it is a different process and far more rewarding when I'm trying to force a predetermined outcome than when I try and force a predetermined outcome at the table. So that's one of the few things I say, don't do that. And unfortunately, like railroading is omnipresent in the adventures and even GMing advice that we consume from a lot of publishers. And part of that, I believe, and part of what So You Want to Be a Game Master is about, is the belief that one of the reasons we see so much of that is that just like when I was a kid trying to figure this out, people don't really have an alternative. Like something I talk about is the fact that like most game masters, in my experience, have just two different scenario structures that they're using. And one of those is a dungeon. They learn somewhere how to make a map and key the map and have their players move through the dungeon. And the second one is railroading. Because we're surrounded by linear plots in other mediums, whether that's movies or short stories or comic books or video games. And so when we're trying to figure this out and we don't have any really good advice about how to do that, this new medium, like that's the thing. It's like role-playing games are this completely new medium that's less than half a century old, and we're all just kind of still figuring it out. And that's really exciting. But it means that like we're all trying to figure it out. And so when you don't have any guidance about, well, how do we figure this out? then you reach for what you're familiar with. And what people are familiar with is a book that describes what the characters do, or a film that shows you what the characters do. And so that's what they write in their notes, because that's where they have examples to work from. And the thing is, like, it's not just that it's bad for the players, it's just a really it's a not fun way of prepping things as a GM, in my experience, because it is so much work. You're putting so much effort into trying to control everything. And so often so often you fail because you aren't even being set up with the right tools to do this questionable thing in the first place. So
no, absolutely. I think what you're saying here, a lot of it breaks down to, like, you've got to trust your players. And a lot of the time when people approach role-playing games, there is a preconception of it's either adversarial, so you're the GM and you're attempting to kill your players, right? Which, frankly, I had a problem with when I was younger. Like, I'd never put anyone into, like, a scenario that was inherently, like, super deadly or, like, you're going to die. But I still had that kind of, like, it's me versus them type of mentality, right? And the shift that you're talking about that happens when you're approaching players, when you're approaching game design or even GM advice, it's very difficult. If I got a published adventure and a note said, hey, trust your players to do cool shit here, like, that doesn't actually serve me as someone who's trying to run the adventure, run the dungeon. So I totally understand where those publishers can come from. But that brings me to this question, which is, like, it sounds like this book is trying to address some of those really persistent problems that start at the game table. So do you have advice in the book that kind of surrounds, like, hey, here are some of the principles, or here's some of the things that, the common things that you're going to run into as an early game master, and here's how to look out for it? For example, me being an adversarial GM, not trusting my players, stuff like that. How does your book really try and approach that, or does it?
That's a really great question, because something I worked on quite a bit in the early development of the book was I was trying to figure out what the approach would be specifically for that kind of thing. And what I needed to first figure out is, who is the primary audience of this book? And the primary audience of this book is someone who hasn't GM'd before. And so on page 1, I assume you've not played a role-playing game before. And I also assume that you've never GM'd before. And so I say, okay, how do I get that person into this world and playing great role-playing games and running great role-playing games? And what I figured out through trial and error is that talking about all the things you shouldn't do was not a great approach for that newbie. And it's something, I mean, if you read articles on the Alexandrian, there's a lot of articles that do take that approach to say, like, for example, like, one of my articles in the Alexandrian is the 3-clue rule. And the 3-clue rule basically starts out being like, we've all been there, we've run a mystery, and it's fallen apart for this reason and this reason and this reason. And I realized, like, I can't use that rhetorical device or stance in this book, because I'll be like, we've all been there. And the people will be like, I have not been there. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes sense some of the negative things too. Like, rather than telling you, this is what railroading is, so don't do that, the book much more takes an approach of, these are the things you should do. And if a first-time GM comes in here and does these things, then they just won't railroad, because that's not the step-by-step approach that the book is showing you how to do. And instead of showing you a different approach that will take you to a different place. And my belief is that if you have the tools to run role-playing games as a collaborative effort with your players, that you won't railroad, because you won't be stuck doing that, because you'll have better options in what you want to do.
And we were also curious, as avid readers of the Alexandrian, what new stuff is going to be appearing in the book as opposed to what's on the Alexandrian. And of course, it sounds like, this is very focused on new GMs, myself, for example. So I'm really curious to check it out, as opposed to the Alexandrian as more, possibly for experienced GMs. But what's new here?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about what really are like the first 50 pages of the book. What happens very quickly is the book does transition and says, hey, you've run your first game. And so there's a lot of material that I think, like, long-time users of the Alexandrian will find fresh and new as well. Because once you get like, everyone's gonna be like, okay, so the book's about like running a dungeon room. I know how to run a dungeon room. You do. But then once we get done with those early dungeons, we begin moving into more advanced material, and including advanced dungeons, but again, all those other scenario structures. So things that have not appeared previously on the Alexandrian that will be in the book include, for dungeons, a fully developed dungeon turn. So an actual procedure for like how do you design a dungeon, but also how do you run a dungeon. And so this is something that used to be found in like every D&D rule book. Like if you go back all the way to 1974 D&D, Gygax and Arneson in those original rule books has an actual procedure that they tell you, like, if the PCs are in the dungeon, do this, then do this, then do this, and a dungeon happens. And it's interesting because you go back and you actually follow that procedure. I mean, first you have to decipher the Gygaxian and Arnesonian prose. But once you've deciphered that prose, if you can follow the procedure, you discover, oh, there's actually a very specific way of like running a dungeon that has a very specific feel and pace. And if you just follow these steps, boy, a game in fact just happens. And that isn't the one true way of gaming or running a dungeon, but it is a way of doing it. And it's very similar in my mind to like how like in a more modern game, like John Harper's Blades in the Dark, he also has a very specific, like, do this, do this, do this, and a very specific game flows out of that. And so this book is really like, hey, you know, what's interesting is that modern D&D doesn't include that step-by-step procedure, so here it is. And so there's a specific dungeon turn procedure that kind of breaks that down. Other things that are completely new in the book, I actually take a close look at raid scenarios and break down a specific method for developing raid scenarios and running raid scenarios. And what else is in here? So several years ago on the Alexandrian, I wrote a series called Thinking About Urban Crawls. And it was an exploration of the history of how we've dealt with cities, and particularly city adventures over the years in role-playing games. And what you're going to find in this book is kind of the culmination, or, you know, culmination strong, because I still have more worlds to explore in the future. But the current state of where those ideas are at. And there's a complete sort of 3-part system, actually 3 to 4-part system for running cities and like actual urban crawl adventures, both how you build a city, how you run a city, a downtime structure, which includes handling faction-based play, and then also a full-fledged urban crawl procedure for actually exploring the city in a way analogous to how like dungeon crawls and hex crawls work. So there's a huge, like, all the whole urban section of the book is all original material that I think will be really exciting for people who are existing fans of the Alexandrian, hopefully for people in general, but particularly people who are fans of the Alexandrian. The other thing is, like, so in the wilderness section, we take a look at hex crawls. So on the Alexandrian, there's a whole long hex crawl series. The approach on the Alexandrian is very much toolkit. I'm like, here's a bunch of stuff, build your own hex crawl system. The approach in the book is much more, here is a hex crawl system. So any Alexandrian reader who has been like, someday I'll get around to building a specific hex crawl procedure from all of the information you dumped on me, Justin, and is just looking for a out-of-the-box solution, this book includes an out-of-the-box solution, which is then also integrated with a system of route-based travel and route-based adventures, and also point crawls, and those are all integrated together. There's a lot of this book which is about integrating ideas into a cohesive system. There's a lot of different articles that have appeared on the Alexandrian over the years, and this book was an opportunity to take those disparate ideas and synthesize them into a cohesive, both reference, but also a cohesive system or method for people looking to actually use them at the table.
We had a question from our listeners. If they obviously, if you're new to GMing, you want to just read the process that Justin explained at the beginning of the book. But the question from Clark was, if you only had 2 chapters to read from, which 2 chapters would they be? And then for me, would those 2 chapters be the ones that you're most excited about having written for the book?
I think I need to give 2 answers to this question because I think the first answer to this question is, like, let's say that you are a first-time GM who's coming and is picking up the book and saying, great, this book is what I want to know because I want to know how to run role-playing games. And for that person, the 2 chapters I would tell them to do is read that first chapter in the book where I talk about the ruling and how to run a room. and then go and run your adventure. But then the second chapter I would actually tell them to go and read would be, this is a really good question. The second chapter I would tell them to go read, I'm literally flipping through my table of contents right now, would be, I would tell them to go read the chapter on running scenes, which is actually in the mystery section of the book. Because what that chapter talks about is how to frame scenes and how to handle pacing at the table. And so if you were looking for like a 2-chapter like thing, the first thing would be 2 essential skills for running dungeons. And then if you can figure out scenes, you can probably muddle a lot of it together beyond that. My second answer to this question is for the person who is, say, an experienced game master or even a reader of the Alexandrian who is coming here and saying, okay, well, what can you show me that will be different than anything I've done before? Where are the new tools that are going to make things really awesome for me? And to some extent, this is going to repeat what I just said about things that are new to the book. But I think people will be really excited about the breakdown of how to run a raid scenario. If you read the article on running heists on the Alexandrian and you're like, boy, I wish there was something like that for raids, there it is. So the raid chapter would be really great as new stuff. And also that urban crawl chapter. I guess I'm going to kind of basically just repeat my answer to that. So I think the new stuff will be what people get most excited about, partly because it's new for Alexandrian readers, but also because these are completely new scenario structures, at least as they appear here. And particularly for the urban crawl is something that has not existed previously. And so I think people will be really excited to explore. Because something I talk about a lot is that every scenario structure you have, like the dungeon is a scenario structure. And if you know how to run dungeons, you can run thousands of dungeons. And a mystery is a scenario structure. And if you know how to structure like a node-based mystery scenario, there are thousands of mysteries that you can run. And those will be very different from the thousands of dungeons that you can run. So every scenario structure that you kind of unlock as a GM for the first time, whether it's something that you're reading about or something that you're creating for yourself, every one of these scenario structures that you figure out how to do it, how to prep it, how to run it, they unlock just this infinite new vista of adventure. And so that's what gets me excited is like, hey, what's this new thing? And what are all the cool things I can do with it?
Guys, you know how much of a pain in the ass I am with like everything we review or look at. Listeners, this is the Bible, okay? If you're GMing, we need to get our hands on this book. Sorry, I just had to gush.
Daniel, you could have stopped at how much of a pain in the ass I am. But no, I actually completely agree. From what you're saying here, Justin, it really sounds like this is like a really great gift idea because I have people who, they know that I run a podcast about world building and about, GMing to a certain extent as well. And oftentimes people will ask me like, hey, like, how do I run a game? Like, I want to play D&D or, I want to learn how to do these things. And now rather than like sending them to like a YouTube playlist or your website, which I very often do, and be like, here's a book that you can just pick up and now you know how to run it. Even if you know how to GM or if you have years of experience as well, it sounds like this is something that is going to be extremely helpful for anyone. And to that, I have to ask, you're on a world building podcast. What kind of world building advice is there for new GMs in this book?
So in terms of world building, my personal philosophy is that there are many ways to build a world, but one of the most effective ways to build a world is to just get the world to the table, because as you're playing the world, that will put demands on you to develop material for that world, and that's where the interesting stuff happens. Like if we talk about like J.R. Tolkien, right? Like Tolkien wanted to write these languages, but in order to write the languages and create those languages, he needed to create an entire world and a vast array of stories in order to like feed that creative impulse. And so a lot of this book is about how to build those scenarios and explore the world through those scenarios. But one of the things that we haven't even touched on yet is the back half of the book. The front half of the book is talking about all these different scenario structures, the dungeons and the raids and the heists and the mysteries and the urban crawls and all of that. But the back half of the book is called Extra Credit. And Extra Credit has like a dozen chapters. And each one of those chapters is kind of targeted advice that is focused on some topic that can enhance any one of the other types of scenarios or a campaign in general. So like there's a chapter in there talking about how to create your campaign. There's a chapter about campaign status documents, how to learn a new RPG, how to run an open table, how to put together rumor tables. And one of the chapters back there is quick and dirty world building. And this is kind of like my little cheat sheet for how, when I'm sitting down to run an RPG campaign for the first time, what is it that I actually like put together in order to create a new world for the players, for the game. And it basically boils down to sort of a three-step process. I know I talk about steps a lot, but it really is just like, you know, I really do believe that like if I tell you to do these three things and then something happens, like that's, you know, that's concrete. That's something you can actually do. That's something you can actually use. So my three-step process I do for this, my quick and dirty world building, is I'm looking to put together what I call a sort of a minimum brief. And that minimum brief consists of writing down broad details about the world, which takes about 1 to 2 pages. And what that is depends on what kind of world I'm creating. If I'm creating like a standard D&D fantasy world, that's probably like, hey, these are like, yeah, for example, when I was doing this for my D&D campaign world, it was, these are the 5 empires, and here's a quick map that shows the outlines of those empires, and that may be enough. You know, like broad details of the world. If you're creating a original like urban fantasy setting, it might be talking about what are the different Fae factions that are influencing the world secretly in the background, kind of thing. So that, you know, 1 to 2 pages of that, and then the second step is, what do you need for character creation? Look at the game that you're running. Look at what, when the players walk through character creation, what are the details about the world that they need? So like in D&D, for example, you need to make sure to have a list of languages, because there's going to be a point where the game says, pick your languages, and the players need to know what languages they can pick. You also probably need to have like a list of gods in D&D, because the clerics and the paladins and so forth are all going to want to be able to pick their deity. So like those are the, and again, that'll vary depending on what game you're running and what type of setting you're creating, but there will probably be some sort of like choices in character creation that are based in the world that you're creating. You want to make sure they have that information. And again, that's probably 1 to 2 pages. And then the third step is I say, okay, now you've got these broad details about the world that kind of sketch in what the overall shape of the world is. Now figure out where the campaign is going to take place, and you want to zoom in on that. And again, do about 1 to 2 pages looking at that specific setting. And like, for example, if you're running a campaign in a city, then it might be like, these are the neighborhoods of the city, and this is who's in charge of the city. And if your campaign is set out in a small village on the borderlands, then maybe it's like, these are the local businesses, and there's the old forest, and there's the troll fens, and so forth. And again, it's just 1 to 2 pages of that kind of high level detail. And what I really think about in terms of that structure is that you're creating a container. You're not creating an entire world. You are creating the box or the framework or the scaffolding. And then as you step in and begin exploring that world with your players, you will fill that box, you will build upon that scaffolding and develop it. So that's kind of the overall approach of world building in the book, is start small and then build from there.
Yeah, that's definitely reminds me of some of the advice that we got when we interviewed Rich Baker. He likened it to like, you want to make sure that you have a stage, you know, with all the setting and the background. And frankly, that's all you need, is just have a stage set up, just one scene. And that's really all you need to get started, because then you know, when your players start asking questions, you start thinking about it. So, you know, it sounds like the container is effectively what you're advocating for here as well, which I think is really interesting. You know, I completely agree. Like, start small, start evocative, get people thinking about what's interesting about your world, right?
Another piece of advice I give that kind of ties into the scaffolding as well, is I say, one of the nice things about building the scaffolding is that you can also focus really precisely on what makes my world unique. Why is this not the Forgotten Realms or Middle Earth? What makes this unique? For example, like talking about local setting, for example, like if you make sure as you design those local settings, is, are there services that the PCs will require? So like to use examples from existing settings, like in Shadowrun, you know that the PCs are going to need Mr. Johnsons who will come and give them targets, and you know that they'll need targets to be pointed at. So you know you need to have those local hypercorps who can be pointed at. Like, those are essential services. In a typical D&D campaign, if you're designing like a little village for D&D, the essential services are typically like, hey, they need like a general store where they can buy adventuring supplies. And they probably will want like an inn, right, where you can go and rest. You'll need a tavern where they can go and like drink and pick up rumors and that kind of thing. What are these essential services? But one of the tips I give is like, what you want to do is look at those and say, how can I twist those away from the generic? Because like I just said, hey, you can have like an inn and a tavern and a general store. And that's fine if that's what you have. But if you give one or all of those a weird twist, then you end up with something interesting and unique. So for example, if instead of like a general store, what if there was a magical artifact in the town square? And when you walk up to it and you put a small sack of gold coins into it and request something, it will seal shut. And then 1d 20 minutes later, the thing will open and it will probably give you what you were looking for. But sometimes it doesn't. It gives you something else. Or if like, we said like, okay, well, you want a tavern for socializing. Well, what if the local community doesn't socialize in a tavern? What if every night when they go to sleep, they all share a dream world together under the local fairy hill?
Mhm.
And so when you sleep in this town, you end up socializing with people in this sort of knob hill. Either one or both of those in your D&D village will immediately, that one twist on that essential service will immediately create something unique and memorable and help to draw the players into that. And then everything that will spill out as a consequence, where'd this machine come from? What is this weird thing that the machine gave me? All of those things will also be what helps you fill out the scaffolding of your world.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a great opportunity for you to tie these kind of fantastical anchor points onto the types of character groups that you're expecting. You know, if we're using previous examples or RPGs, I'm thinking of like Dogs in the Vineyard, right? You're inherently tied to the church in some way. And so exploring world building and the world at large, like, oh, the church really means something to these characters, and there's architecture there that's already in place, the scaffolding that you're talking about. Or if you wanted to talk about something like Spire, which is really great, you know, like the fantastical world that is Spire, your revolutionary drow, like, okay, how is that represented? Well, you're going to need fences and you're going to have other revolutionaries. There's this underground aspect to it. Like all of that together, like builds your world, but it keeps it into a tight container that you're talking about. So yeah, that is a really interesting way that you can really enhance that instant world build. Like that's a packet of flavor immediately.
Yeah. And I guess on the note of, enhancements, what are your thoughts on add-ons like music and visuals and even physical props? Like, do you use those in your own games? Do you recommend that GMs use those as well?
I use those a lot in my own games. So
Mhm.
like in terms of music, my evolution on that. So years ago, I used to, for every adventure, I would prep a soundtrack specifically for that adventure by going through like all of
Mhm.
my anime and game soundtracks and movie soundtracks, and I pick out specific tracks for different parts of the adventure. And that approach was incredibly labor intensive, and I eventually decided that I needed to work smarter, not harder. And so what I did instead was I went through and pulled together generic playlists. So for example, on my iPod, I have a list of D&D combat music, for example, or Eclipse Phase atmosphere. And so rather than having like something specifically key to the specific adventure, I have broad categories of music on playlists, and so I can then queue up the appropriate playlist. And I find that to be very effective in terms of being able to very easily use that tool over and over and over again for years now in terms of using those playlists. And then occasionally doing something specific. I'm a huge fan of physical props at the table. They're incredibly immersive. And particularly if you're running anything like is a mystery or a conspiracy-based scenario, putting the clues in physical
Oh
form
yeah.
is great because first, it's more memorable. And
Yeah.
B, when they inevitably forget that the clue exists, it's still just there on the table. So they can always just, oh yeah, this thing, we should do something about this. So I think that's really great. And also anytime that you're exploring a fictional setting or historical setting, an unfamiliar setting for the players, I love to, if I can find the time and the resources, put together dioramas on the wall of my gaming space, sort of visual
Oh, wow.
references for things.
Yeah.
So, like on the Alexandrian, I did a remix of the Eternal Lies campaign for Trail of Cthulhu. And in that campaign, which is in the 1930s, the PCs visit several different cities in the 1930s, Bangkok and in the remix, they can go to like London, for example. And so for each one of those cities, I tracked down a poster size map from the time period, and I would put that on the wall for reference. And then I would also pull down like advertisements from the time and like photos from the time and people and objects and vehicles. And I would just post those on the wall around the map, usually like 20 to 30 little individual images. Super easy to find in the modern era with like Google image searches and the like, right? But just print them out, put them up there. And then both I and the players now have a visual palette that we can draw from that both helps both to imagine the world as we describe it, but also so many times I would be like, oh, yeah, this NPC you meet is that guy right there. Because I would include like some photos of people who were just people from the time period. I didn't know who they were or if they'd even be part of the game, but they were a resource that I could draw from. Or I'd be like, a car drives past and it's that car right there. And it would look as if I'd like just been meticulously prepared for anything that they would do. But in fact, I was just using the tool that we all had there, which was to pull this visual influence into the game.
I want to dive deeper on your physical setup because I found the more I'm playing and the more I'm trying to develop how I play, I find the physical setup is just so important to me to be like ready to go. And I'm running remotely. So like in my setup, I have like 3 monitors, but I have my physical notes printed in front of me and they're in a specific order. That way I can find, you know, like, oh, here's the stats, here's like the scene I'm in, stuff like that, laid out physically on the table. What does your physical layout look like for you when you're thinking like, oh, I'm sitting down and ready to run this game? What's on the table and what are you looking at?
Yeah, so I find that like every game I run is a little bit different in that regard, but I do have a few secret weapons. One of my secret weapons is I have a modular GM screen, landscape, to like be able to clearly look over it and see body language of me and the players. But I prepare a cheat sheet for the game system that I'm running that I call it a comprehensive cheat sheet because my goal is to include every rule in the rule book. I don't include things like character options and the like, but I do try to include every single rule in the rule book on this cheat sheet. And then I have that on my modular GM screen. And as I like to say, it's really easy to fake being a master of a role-playing game when all the rules are like 6 inches in front of your nose. And so that's my first secret weapon. And I like to have that on the GM screen because it takes all that reference material and puts it vertical on the table. It takes it off the surface of the table. So it's always accessible there, but it's not taking up any of the table surface in front of me because, as you observe, table surface and what is there is so vitally crucial.
Yeah, it's shocking how important it is. Like in a moment when you're trying to execute a critical scene, like having that one bullet point exactly in front of you is so much more helpful than like, oh crap, which page is that on? Then you're fucked,
right?
You know.
So my second secret weapon in terms of setting up my space is to actually multiply my table surface. TV trays. I will take at least one TV tray and I will put it to the left or right of my chair. And that TV tray is where I should take like my rule books, for example, and my campaign status document will be there. And so those are all not, again, on the table in front of me. They are off to one side, within reach, right there, right? But like it leaves that space in front of me open so that whatever I'm currently running for the current scene, whether if it's a combat scene, I will have prepped a stat sheet that has all the stats for the monsters in that combat there, right? Or maybe they're on 2 different sheets or whatever. But like I'll pull them and put them, and then instead of having to flip back and forth through a monster manual or whatever, I will just be able to like flick my eyes from one monster to another. The information is all right there, right? I'll do the same thing in social scenes. So like if the PCs are in like a social event, for example, well, I'll pop open my 3-ring binder and pull out the NPC briefing sheets that I have. So I'll make sure that each NPC is on a single sheet. And I'll pull out the sheets of the NPCs who are in the scene and I'll lay them out on the table. So I don't have to move between them. They're just all immediately visible to me. And again, that ability to just be able to like glance at the table and very quickly access multiple pieces of information without flipping back and forth is a secret weapon. It makes everything go so much smoother at the table. And it's just a matter of making sure that the information you need is there right in front of you.
This is me writing down TV trays into my notes here. Secrets of the Sensei.
I have a D&D campaign set in Monty Cook's Tolus that I've been running since 2008. And
wow.
it's a long-running campaign. It has ups and downs in terms of how often we can play. Just before COVID, most of the people at the table all had kids in like the same summer. like within months of each other. So things slowed down for a little bit in that group for a little while there.
Oh,
And
that's
then COVID
weird
happened.
that it would happen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so odd that would have an impact on our gaming. So it slowed down a bit. Then we had COVID and we had to take a long break from it. But we've been getting back into it. But for that game, I've built up so much material, and it's actually a third edition D&D campaign. So I have a bunch of third edition supplements. I actually have 3 TV trays that I had set up in an L shape, so I have enough space for the stack of binders that has all the campaign notes in it, and the stack of third edition rule books, and the stack of Tolus and city supplements that I use for the campaign, while still leaving me all my open space for what's actually happening in the current scene.
That is such a stark contrast to like, this is infamous at my table because Daniel and Courtney both look at my notes and they're like, how the fuck? How did you do that? Because it's literally like 4 sentences and like there's a comic out there where it's just like sexy goblins ? Like as like the only note. I think that prep really matters, right? I'm a big proponent of like creating prep and creating like the skeletons of what you want to do. But when it comes to a lot of the other stuff, I am just so loosey-goosey. But I definitely don't want to take away from your overall like experience, because like my case is different and unique. Frankly, I would much rather put, newer GMs in your hands rather than my note-taking system.
Well, this is something I talk about in the book, actually, is that like, don't prep what you see in a published adventure, because that published adventure is an author trying to communicate their internal vision to you. And because you can't read their mind, they have to put a lot of stuff on the page in order to communicate that to you.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're prepping notes for yourself, well, you can read your mind. You do that all the time. So, you can write sexy goblins, for example, and you know exactly what that means. If I was writing sexy goblins in a published adventure, right, I'd have to actually explain what the heck I'm talking about, like what their function is in the scene. And so, yeah, when you're prepping stuff for yourself, your notes can be a lot more sketchy and a lot more loosey-goosey because you can trust yourself. You can trust future you at the table to know what you were talking about. You can also trust future you to improvise at the table in a way that is consistent with your creative vision of how this scene or this character or this environment was supposed to be done.
I mean, on this very topic, and also goes back to what Courtney had asked you in the beginning, like for me, what made me feel really comfortable was after having read your articles on node-based scenario design. Like that for me was like the game changer, because suddenly there was this lattice to work with that it wasn't railroading, but it also gave me the freedom to let the players have a sandbox to operate in that had a structure to it. And when you mentioned nodes, I think it's like super important for listeners to zero in on that, because that changed the game for me. It made it possible to GM in a way that wasn't before I knew that was a process to go through to build the adventure.
Well, I think that's a great point too, because oftentimes someone will say, well, I don't want to, you shouldn't prep plots, or you shouldn't prep a railroad, or you shouldn't have these sort of like things. And then people are like, well, but if I don't do that, then what do I do? And the idea becomes that like, well, if you don't have a plot, then you have no structure at all. And it's like, well, it's a different structure, right?
Right. Exactly.
The analogy I'll use is like, when people first started making movies in the late 19th and early 20th century, they were like, oh, what is this like? Oh, it's like we're filming a play. And so if you look at early movies, a lot of them are like a play on a stage that's being filmed, right? And what people figured out, and that worked, but like eventually people figured out, actually, wait, though, we're not on a stage. There's lots of things we can cut. We can do things with film that we can't do on a stage. And that's when film became its own thing. And I think we're kind of in the similar place with role-playing games, where initially be like, well, what do we do? Well, I guess we just, we make a plot, because that's the structure that we have. And we're getting to the point where we can explore other structures that are equally robust and give you just as much structure and scaffolding to play with, but that are unique to role-playing games and empower you in role-playing games.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that in action recently, very much so. I mean, Daniel, of course, uses node-based design in his own adventures, but he and I are both playing in a game that's run by a friend of ours named Will, and the game is just utter chaos. Just the party composition is chaos. The adventures that we've decided to go on, we haven't just gone off the rails. We've burned the rails to the ground. They are no longer there at all. And somehow Will has done a fantastic job keeping everything together and making it seem like he he had a plan, even though we just completely walked by what he had planned for us initially. And so can definitely attest to the power of node-based design there. Absolutely.
Yeah, I love. I just love the chaos that you've told me from that's going on from that campaign as well. Just because it's like burning down the tracks doesn't make sense. They've smelted down the tracks and then now using them to actively antagonize the
Yes.
GM.
Yeah.
It's basically like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, but like if there were like 6 Mr. and Mrs. Smiths.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess going back to like a much broader topic of, GMing overall, and every GM is different, but since you've been running games for quite a while now, like how have you seen GMing overall change over the decades? And, do you see more of an emphasis on, for example, collaborative storytelling now than you have in the past?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are errors, right? Like when I first started gaming in '89, I was getting into things. The Dragonlance saga was still fresh in everyone's mind, and we were just moving into this era in the '90s, particularly of heavy railroaded linear, like the GM is here to share their story with you kind of thinking. And then in the early 2000s, we see these indie RPGs kind of pop up and begin saying, there's other ways to explore a story than from on high. And then we see the old school revolution and kind of a renaissance of going back to the early days and like, well, what were these structures that we were playing with? And we are beginning to see in the work of D. Vincent Baker, in the work of John Harper, in my own work, we are beginning to see, I think, more exploration of these structures. And then at the same time that we're doing that, in terms of having different structures of play that create different experiences at the table, we're also, of course, now seeing the heavy influence from actual play, from Critical Role, from Dimension 20, from other actual play shows, and that influence from theater and performance, and the idea of, how do I want to put this? The idea that we are creating a group of interesting characters and then giving them an opportunity to interact with each other. That there's sort of a performance-based, a character-driven approach. And so that's, that interesting mix of influences right now. But with that being said, like I have a YouTube channel. I just got done writing a video talking about blue booking. And blue booking is this concept that came from back in the 80s. Aaron Alston, who was a designer back then, wrote a campaign for the Champions game called Strike Force. And if you go back and read his original Strike Force campaign book, it is this treasure trove of really innovative GMing techniques that are still applicable today, and many of them are still revolutionary today. And in many ways, many of us have just been reinventing the wheel of Strike Force. So it's interesting. There are all these sort of phases of what's popular in GMing, but there are people who are doing the same stuff from the beginning. And I think it's really interesting just sort of which facet we focus on at a given time.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It really shows the kind of like morphic qualities that role-playing games tend to have, especially if you follow the history and the trends of the hobby and of the, well, I'm going to say art form, but like it is really fascinating how it is often representative of like, what is the culture interested in? What is the culture want to explore? When you look at something like the waning popularity of D&D during the early 2000s and the late 90s, when all of a sudden Vampire the Masquerade was on its way up and stuff like that. Like, why are those, like cultural waves kind of happening? That's not my question. My question is actually a little bit more heady than that. It's just because I'm currently getting my master's in English, and I'm actually focusing on role-playing games in general from an academic sense. So I have a question for you regarding that, which is, what do you think role-playing games do?
Interesting. It's interesting having the academic side of that, because I actually remember when I went to college, I had a professor, Thomas Clayton, who was actually a great classics professor. And I was in a freshman class of his, a freshman survey of his. And he would, like with his freshman surveys, he would pull each individual freshman and have a chat with them about who they are and what their goals are. And so I get called in for that meeting. And I remember him asking, so I told him doing this role-playing game stuff. As actually, I'm already working as a freelancer in the industry. He's like, what is it about role-playing games that really appeals to you? And I was like, well, it is about storytelling. And like at the time, I was also involved in theater. It also was writing short stories. And I was like, it's all about storytelling. It's all about different ways of telling stories. And the trick to what a role-playing game is goes all the way back to the campfire, where we all gather around the campfire and we tell stories together as a way of understanding the world. And what I find so fascinating about role-playing games is that we have in this generation, in living memory, we have found a new way of telling and sharing stories and exploring stories together. And for me, the essential image of what a role-playing game can be, and a phrase that I've been playing with more and more, is active play. That when we are playing a role-playing game, that we are actively playing with each other. And players have been doing this forever, because a player comes to the table and they have their character, and as the GM tells them the situations that they are in, the players actively play that character. Like, no player comes to a table and has their character and says, okay, well, I've prepped the 5 things I'm going to do today with this character, right? They don't do that. That would be weird. What they have is just they have a toy to play with, and they come and they actively play. And the cool thing about role-playing games is, A, that you can do that active play, that you can do this moment of you can do anything is the promise. And where the game really comes alive is when the GM gets on the same page. And the GM is also there to do anything, to take what the players are giving them and react to them the same way in the moment, react in the moment in the same way that the players are reacting in the moment with their developments, with their storytelling elements, with their world elements, the same way that those players are reacting to what the GM is giving them. And when everybody at the table is in that state of active play, that is when I believe role-playing games reach their full potential as a medium, because that is the point where we're doing something where everyone at the table is doing something that is completely unique to the medium.
Yes, that is the type of answer that I'm so fascinated. So normally this is where I would pinwheel off of this particular discussion and continue, and we would chat for another 45 minutes. However, we should probably pivot over to some patron questions that we've received for this interview. Daniel, do you want to hit us, or Courtney, either one of you? Do either of you want to start with one of our patron questions?
Sure. Let's see. One of our patrons, Johnny Law, has a question about what are your tips for splitting the party? It sounds like he recently had an experience where the party got split and he actually used the other players to participate as NPCs in the current action.
That's a great technique to use, particularly in a situation where one of the PCs has, or one or more of the PCs that end up in a situation where they are bogged down in something that is not interesting. There's actually a whole chapter in So You Want to Be a Game Master talking about splitting the party. So I could talk about this for a while. But the key thing I will say is that I actually think splitting the party is fantastic. Like, we have this meme about, never split the party. And that meme exists for a reason. And there's really 2 big reasons. First off, if you're in deadly circumstances and you split the party, then you've made yourself more vulnerable. You've weakened each individual group, right? And also, as a GM, there is a challenge to juggling 2 sets of continuity at the same time. Like, if juggling 1 set of continuity is difficult enough, now we've got 2 sets of continuity to juggle. But in both cases, from both the player's perspective and the GM's perspective, I think when you get just a little bit beyond that basic neophyte level, you'll discover that splitting the party is a great idea a lot of the time. Because if you're not in a situation where, like, lethal firepower is on the line, splitting the party lets the group take multiple actions at the same time. So if there's any kind of scenario where there's any kind of time pressure, like if you're investigating a serial killer and you want to try and catch them before they kill again, then splitting the party is like basically getting like 5 or 6 actions on your turn in combat. You get to do all these things at one time. So that's great. From the GMing standpoint, once you start thinking about how to pace scenes and engage the players through pacing, splitting the party often is basically like a cheat code for easy pacing, because when the whole group is together and you're working on pacing that scene, you only really have two tools, and those tools are you can start a scene and you can end a scene, and those are powerful tools, but they are limited. Once you have two different groups of PCs, you can start cutting back and forth between the two different groups. And once you have that, there's all kinds of other techniques that you can use. But the great thing about that on just a meta level is that whenever you as a game master are uncertain about what should happen next in a scene, cut to the other scene, right? He's like, oh, I don't know what should happen next. Let's cut to the other group and do some stuff with them. And I can be thinking in the background, what am I going to do when I get back to that other scene? Absolutely. So that's a really practical thing that can be actually very powerful even for a young game master to be able to just like, let me come back to that, but like not put the whole game on pause. And then the flip side of that too is that one of my favorite things to do, just from a purely practical standpoint, there's more advanced artistic techniques you can buy the book to find out about. But one of my favorite from a practical standpoint is anytime like I'm like, hey, can you roll damage for that fireball? Well, that takes time, right? They have to count the dice out. They roll the dice. They count the dice. Cut away immediately. You roll the damage for the fire dice. Meanwhile, with the other group, let's play with them. And so you can really tighten things up. And you can also, like, for example, let's say you're in a scene with a bunch of characters and those players are all discussing what they should do next or role playing with each other in some conversation, right? Cut away from them, go to the other group. Now you've got the other side is continuing to talk to each other. This doesn't work when you're gaming virtually. At the table, though, it's fantastic. So they can continue playing. So they're playing, and you're also focusing on the other group. And suddenly, it's like you've increased the amount of spotlight time at the table. It's like you've got a time machine because now you're getting more gaming in the same temporal package. Everybody's getting to do more stuff. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do with splitting the party.
I love that. I definitely try and also think of it as like, it's a definite opportunity to be cinematic, right? Where think about how you'll watch a movie or you'll watch a TV show where they cut to the other team as they're coming in, right? Like even in heist movies, splitting up and like making sure that the plan all goes together, like that's just a natural part of the narrative of like that shifting focus, right?
I also do something called crossovers, which is when you have an element in one scene and then you cut to the other and discover the element is there too. Like you're in one scene and one group of players discovers that the red mask is behind this. And then you cut to the other scene and somebody in a red mask walks in, right? Like you get that contrast between the two things.
Yeah.
The other practical tip too I'll give is that one easy pitfall you can fall into when you're thinking about splitting the party is, so the party's doing something and two people split off and they drive across town to go do something. And you think, oh, well, it'll take them like 15 minutes to get there. So I need to spend 15 minutes with this group in the game world before I can even go do anything with them. And one thing you can do is just to desync time. So that group left to go search the warehouse or whatever, and this group stayed here to do something at the restaurant. You can do a little bit of stuff at the restaurant and then cut to the other group, even though they're technically in the future, and still do that cut back and forth. So don't get stuck in that cul-de-sac of thinking, oh, well, it's not literally happening at the same time, so I can't take advantage of all the cool stuff you can do with cutting between parties.
Mm-hmm.
So one question is from Diploraptor, and that is when you're doing your design work, do you start at a macro level in terms of, I think this is in terms of world building, or do you start at a micro level when you're constructing the setting?
Well, Diploraptor, thank you so much for that question. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but yeah, I typically, if I'm the first step, I think what I'm going to describe this as is bracketing, is that when I'm first engaging with the world or a scenario for that matter, I will spend some time at a very high level, and then I will spend time at a very focused low level. And then maybe it's thinking about in terms of like filling in towards the middle. Like we talked about this in terms of world building earlier, like start with that big high level thing, then zoom in on the local level. But the same thing can also be really true of adventure design for me. But for example, if I'm designing a node-based mystery where I want to have like a number of nodes, which can be like locations and people and organizations and so forth that are connected to each other via clues, I'll often start that process at a very high level where I say, okay, well, like, let's say you're investigating an organization. I will say, okay, well, what is this organization? What are some things I know about it? And I'm not going to dive into like a lot of details. I'm just going to kind of sketch it in. And I'm going to make like a list of like, well, what types of nodes make sense for this? You're investigating, let's say, a Colombian drug cartel. Okay, well, what kinds of things would this Colombian drug cartel have? Well, there's going to be somebody who's in charge. There'll be a boss. There'll be someplace that boss lives. There'll be someplace where they're processing the drugs. There'll be someplace where they're selling the drugs, etc. Right?
Mhm.
You have that kind of high level concept stuff. You just make a brainstorming list of all that. But then I like to begin drilling down and pick one of those things that's inspiring me and drill down very specifically into it. So, for example, I will say, let's grab the drug preparation aspect of that. And I'll say, okay, let's take a really close look at this. And one of the things I'm looking there is because when you're at a high level like that, you're often going to end up drifting into generic, right? Because you're painting with very broad strokes, you end up with broad strokes. But then picking one element and driving in and asking, what is unique about this? What is the if it's appropriate, what is the one weird twist that I can give to this concept? So if I'm in a supernatural kind of setting, like an urban fantasy setting for this drug cartel, I drive in on the process they're using to make the drugs, and I say, okay, well, what's the one weird twist here? And the weird twist is that the cocaine that they're making is actually being brought out of the fairylands. Their drug processing plant is actually a portal to the fairylands, and they are adulterating the cocaine with fey dream dust. I don't even know what all that means yet, but like immediately I'm like, okay, well that begins having impacts on everything else. Because like, oh, what if they have this fayish connection? Why do they have the fayish connection? Well, I immediately think, okay, well, the drug boss is probably actually an elf, a fayish elf, elf spirit that has somehow crossed over from the fey world. And then the whole scenario begins rolling out. But you start high, so you get just a little bit of structure, and then drill in on something very specific and develop that in detail. And then those details can often, I find, sort of explode into the rest of the scenario and fill it in.
That's amazing. I'm sorry, I got really distracted when you say this one weird trick because my brain has been ruined by the internet. So now I'm like, this one weird trick. All GMs hate him because of this one weird trick. So you'll have to excuse me. Yeah.
Well, speaking of things that all GMs might potentially hate, a question from our patron Lord of All Chris's. He's asking, what are your thoughts on AI dungeon masters that Wizards of the Coast is supposedly working on?
Yeah, as we're recording this, we just had the scandal break yesterday about the AI art creeping into Wizards' Big B book, for example. And it's a very complicated the AI stuff, and we call it AI, but it's really just it's not intelligence. It's a large language model, right? So this LLM stuff is complicated, both in terms of the ethics of how it's being created and also the ethics of how it's being used. I will say that I'm not one of those who believes that there's no way that these tools can be used responsibly. There's actually a YouTube channel I subscribe to called Corridor Crew, and they've been experimenting with how to use these processes to create short animated films. And it's a very interesting, the videos they've done about that are really interesting to check out if you're interested in this topic. Because what the Corridor Crew is they're actually a small special effects house that's been making YouTube videos based on special effects and do special effects work. And so they're coming at it from a special effects standpoint, which is a really interesting place to come to it from, because if you look at the history of like CGI, special effects, it is a long history of people doing things meticulously by hand and then figuring out how to ask a computer to do all that for them. So like if you go back to like the 90s, for example, and you have some scene with like a huge like dam bursting and water pouring out, they would have had to like hand animate the motion of the water. And then someone was like, well, let's actually program a physics engine and we can just hit a button and the computer will take care of all of that for us. We go from like hand animating CGI characters to having elaborate motion tracking rigs and even more advanced tools as well. So they're coming from it from the standpoint of the special effects artists who have spent decades, in some cases, learning their craft and perfecting their craft and developing their craft in an environment where their goal is to achieve the effect that they want, the artistic effect that they want, with increasing levels of automation that let them do that in a more efficient and directed fashion. And so they have a very unique insight as artists about what these tools mean and how they can be used. So it's an interesting perspective. I know that for me personally, I have used like ChatGPT, for example, primarily as a way of like cheap idea generation. What I 5 years ago, I would have just gone into Google and been like, let's say that I want a list of like 20 locations in a fantasy city for whatever reason. And like 5 years ago, I would have like Google like locations in a fantasy city and then scan through the search results and hope for the best. And now I can go to ChatGPT and be like, give me a list of 20 fantasy city locations. And it probably will not do a very good job the first time, but I do it 2 or 3 times and then I take a few items and I tweak. And so it's a really good way of like spurring creativity. So to circle all the way back to the actual question, which was AI game masters.
Yes.
You know, there will definitely be a demand for them, because I think like a lot of people, role-playing games are a hobby that you can only engage with other people for the most part. But solo play and various forms of solo play have been with us for a long time, whether that's going all the way back to like 1977 and Traveller having a life path character generation system where you could sit there and just generate characters. Even more basically, I remember when I was working in D&D, I would just sit in my room and roll up characters. I just roll 3d6 in order over and over again, name the characters, pick a class. I had like a huge stack of these because every time I would do that, it was a way of engaging with the game, even though I couldn't be with my friends in that moment playing the game. So I think there'll definitely be a demand. I know from a practical standpoint, the biggest thing that these LLMs are still struggling with, and I don't know that there even necessarily is a solution within the current models for how these are developing, is continuity. And to be a GM, one of the things you have to be able to manage is the state of the world, the state of the fictional world. And to keep that consistent is one of the most important things for a game master to do. And it's one of the things that AI right now is absolutely terrible at, because it's not designed to do that. It's designed to like hallucinate words onto a page. So I think we're a long way away from having truly functional AIs. But a long way away in the current era, maybe like 2 years. So, by definition of long.
Yeah, we're looking at like an 18-month window, effectively, right?
Yeah.
All right, so let's wrap up our patron-only questions here. We've got one coming in from one Clark R. Rowanson. He wants to know, Justin, now that you've completed the perfect book, what are your plans for the future?
Boy, I really hope this ends up being the perfect book. That would be a first, honestly. I am a huge perfectionist, and frequently have the thing where something comes out and I'm like, well, that sucked. Let's try better next time, even no matter how good it is. But I'm really hoping this book will in fact be really good. So plans for the future. Boy, that's a big question, because I have a lot of plans for the future, and there are many different threads. I know that, so I have this book coming out. I am hoping actually to do a sort of more traditional collection of Alexandrian essays at some point in the future. So in terms of like GMing advice books, that's probably what's next. I was actually working on that project when PhD Publishing reached out to me about doing So You Want to Be a Game Master. And so I was like, well, if I have the opportunity to do that, we're going to go all in on that. But so I still have this kind of half-finished manuscript of like selections from the Alexandrian. That will also be another way of people who have been like, where's the book? I'll be like, well, now there's 2 of them, hopefully in the near future. I say that, I probably jinxed it. We'll never see it. But that's my hope, people have that. I'm also really, I also want to be doing actual role-playing game design stuff, of course, as well. Right now at Atlas Games, we are working on an adventure anthology for Magical Kitties Save the Day. We had just wrapped up Magical Kitties Noir earlier this year, and now we're working on a new adventure anthology for that. So I'm working on that. On a personal basis, I am working on the Hex Noir supplement for the Tech Noir role-playing game, and I'm hoping to have that out by the end of this year. I said that last year as well, so I knock on wood as I say that. So that's on the horizon. Over at the Alexandrian, at the website, I am currently in the process of prepping and running a Night's Black Agents campaign based on the the Delagny Quartet, which is a campaign from Pelgrane Press. So there may be a remix of the Delagny Quartet coming from the Alexandrian as well. So all of those, and then also, like I said, a lot of things kind of like in the fire at the moment. I'm also hoping to actually be able to put some time in on what I'm calling my tri-crawl campaign, which is to have a mega dungeon, a hex crawl, and an urban crawl that are all the same setting in a single supplement. So you can just pick it up and run it, which would be set in my city of Dwyrdel. And Dwyrdel is this city on what is now the edge of civilization that several hundred years ago used to do trade with the dwarven kingdoms of the east. All the trade of the dwarves would flow through this trade city into the human realms. And a few hundred years ago, an orcish army breached the dwarf kingdoms, got inside the mountains, and then swept down the dwarven highway from one dwarven city to the next, and the dwarven cities fell. And so for the last couple hundred years, Dwyrdel, which was this hugely rich city, no longer has the dwarven trade, and so it has been slowly collapsing because that no longer exists. So it was this decayed, once decadent city, this sort of gothic setting of a city that dreams of its glory days, and then a hex crawl between it and the old dwarven megacity, which is now the mega dungeon. And so having all three of those elements is something I'm really hoping to develop, not just because I think it would be cool, but also because for like sharing out there in the world, but also because like I really want to get another open table going for myself post COVID. And this is what I want that open table to be. So I really want to get that to the table as well as begin sharing with people. So
if anything, you're never not a busy man. I mean, like, ambitious.
That's very true.
You're busy. I mean, like, I think I've asked you before, like, how the hell do you write so much? Are you still using the Pomodoro technique where you can?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, so there's definitely that. Like, it is technique where I have a timer and I basically work for 25 minutes and the timer goes off, and then I switch to a 5-minute timer and I do something else for 5 minutes, and then I can refocus on writing for 25 more minutes. And the thing I found works really well for that is actually comic books, because in about 5 minutes I can read an issue of a typical modern comic book usually. So I'll write for like 25 minutes and then I'll put on the 5-minute timer and pick up whatever graphic novel or comic book says I'm reading, read about an issue of content, and then be able to close that and go back to focusing on the writing for 25 minutes. I'm rambling on about like random time hacks, but like that 5-minute break is really great. Because if you're like, I'm going to work for 2 hours, but like 45 minutes in, you're like, I'm going to like stare at the ceiling for a while. But that constant like engagement, re-engagement makes me much more productive.
I love that. All right. You talk about time, and Justin, it is just about time that we are at the Worldbuilding Jam. It's everyone's favorite section of the podcast. This is, for anyone who is new and listening to this for the first time, this is where we roll a bunch of dice, and based on what we roll, we create a world building setting or scenario. So first things first, we have to start with our genre. And our genre that we're rolling this time is going to be post-apocalyptic sci-fi. Our theme for our post-apocalyptic sci-fi is invasion. And the first thing that we're focusing on is going to be something monstrous. So as our guest of honor, really, Justin, please tell us what you're thinking. We've got a sci-fi post-apocalyptic world where the theme is invasion and we're focusing on something monstrous. Where is your brain currently going?
For some reason, I am immediately drawn to the idea that the post-apocalyptic world is not Earth, that it is science fiction grabs me. So, but like, let's keep it somewhat grounded. So it's another planet or moon in the solar system that has been colonized, and now we're entering into a post-apocalyptic phase with that. So maybe let's say Europa, the moon of Jupiter, is where we're at. There are some colonies have been built, drilling down into the oceans of Europa. Let's start there.
That's my favorite moon in our solar system. There's a great movie about that as well. That's pretty new. Can the station be under the ocean that they built for some reason?
Yeah, I think that works.
Excellent. Now, the thing that we're focusing on, something monstrous. What are we looking at here?
Does it come from the depths of Europa and its frozen oceans, or does it come from someplace else, or does it come from the sky?
Did they perhaps dig too greedily and too deep into the ocean and uncovered something?
The plot of the movie. Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, I know, like, right? Like, I feel like that's almost too easy, too obvious to go there, right?
Can we twist it so it comes from under the ocean, but there's a twist to that?
Okay.
Like I'm thinking, like, so for example, on Pacific Rim, right? To reference that one, there's like an interdimensional portal or whatever. I'm not suggesting that, but something that it's not quite from under the ocean, but that's where it's emerging from.
Oh, what if? Yeah, so Europe is this frozen ice ball, has the oceans underneath. What if, this will be weird, what if, like, we dig down, we build our colony ship, we begin exploring, and that's when we discover that the underside of the ice has been marked with these ancient sigils.
Ooh.
And the icy shell of Europa was actually a prison.
Oh,
Like,
yes.
It was sealing something in.
There we go. Yeah.
That is so Raised by Wolves. That's exactly what it is. I love it.
And so when we drilled through the ice to build our underwater colony, like, we created like a pinprick breach in those sigils. But that then sympathetically means that, like, there's an equal pinprick breach someplace else within the heart of the planet.
What I'm actually thinking of right now is this, there's this ongoing, like, debate, like, or there's ongoing discussion rather. How do we ensure that future generations will know where we store radioactive material? Like, what kind of symbols will be universal even to a civilization 20,000 years, 30,000 years into the future? And I can't help but think that, the prison that was created, like, these sigils are definitely a warning that was left to something that a previous intelligence that's trying to warn people, like, please do not uncover this thing, whatever it is. It is a constant threat. They know that is going to be an ongoing threat.
The ancient sigils aspect, of course, makes me think of Event Horizon, and that's sort of like demonic, otherworldly presence. So, well, I also wonder, like, if the sigils are under the ice, that seems like not the ideal place for a warning spot for those sigils.
Well, are the sigils a warning, or are they like a magical seal?
Yeah, they could be that. Yeah.
I mean, we have the magical seal. We could add, like, there was a warning that, like, has been iced over on the surface. Like, they tried to leave a universal warning, but they did not take into account, or unable to actually account for the great passage of time.
I mean, we may not understand it either, but it's possible perhaps they ignored it, and then some scientist is trying to interpret it, and they only interpret it when it's too late, like it's already been punctured.
Yeah, that could be it.
What I'm trying to picture here is, because it's monstrous, right? Like, what about it is monstrous? Because do we want to leave this as some unknowable thing? And if so, like, how do we make it visceral and real to the people who are encountering, or at least are engaging, surrounding that area?
I mean, I think the most monstrous thing you can encounter is some twisted version of yourself.
I had a feeling you were going to go in that direction.
Well, what if it's actually the water?
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
What if it's just in the water, whatever it is, and everything was fine when we first went there because we brought our own supplies, but now we're bringing online these water purification plants that are supposed to let us drink the waters of Europa, and the people who are testing that water are becoming exposed to that water at the water treatment plant.
So Solaris direction, I love it. Solaris has, like, this ocean that's like sentient. I think that will work.
Oh, interesting. I was thinking, like, yeah, what if by consuming the water, they are giving it some of their life essence, which allows the water to take on these distorted doppelganger type shapes that you were talking about.
See, that's interesting, because then you can frame it as, where are these doppelgangers coming from? And it's something as innocuous as drinking a glass of water, right? Yeah, that I think that can work. Yeah.
I like that it's holistic too. It encompasses the whole of the planet. So it's not like this evil entity emerging. It's just like you're dealing with something that's natural, which is still at the heart of what sci-fi is, you know?
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
And then, since we're dealing specifically with post-apocalyptic sci-fi, like
Yes,
this
yeah.
must take place, after potentially these doppelgangers have had some sort of uprising or have taken over in some way.
Are they among us now?
Well, is that the cause for the original apocalypse, right? Like that's kind of the not the one that drove us to the moon in the first place, but the one that caused them to seal it, right? Like, oh, the last vestiges of this sentient race, they've sealed them away, but it caused the destruction and the death of their planet/civilization. Well, if we're stumped, it sounds like it's a good time to roll a twist and see what direction the story takes. And our twist this time is going to be there really are monsters under the bed.
Wow, that's pretty apparent.
I love our twist list because, man, sometimes it's super obvious and sometimes it's like really weird. So what do we think monsters really are under the bed? I mean, that's literal in the sense that it's under the ice or is the water itself, right? But maybe we can take it thematically or metaphorically a step further.
Well, bed suggests sleep. Sleep suggests dream.
Yeah.
Is there something to the idea of dream walking, of sleepwalking, of a world that we enter when we are sleeping in this place?
Yeah, I was thinking that too, based on what you were talking about earlier with your reference to like a town where people go to sleep and then enter the dream world to socialize.
Right.
And the phrasing "monsters are under the bed." I'm imagining that it's not a particularly nice dream that these people experience.
What if the doppelgangers that we're talking about here are subconscious, like they're living, like you ingest this water and in the dreams you start getting pulled further and further away from active consciousness, and all of a sudden you start having like broken time, some kind of like messed up perception of time, where like this other personality is emerging in you, and so like there's a split where you're not sure what is even happening, and like it happens at different times. I think that might be an interesting way to kind of have that manifest as well.
What do these things want?
I imagine that.
I don't know. Yeah.
You know what? I just had a thought, and you guys can bounce this if it doesn't make sense. But what if it's not our post-apocalypse? What if the post-apocalypse is what the entities in the water are experiencing? What if a European civilization or something like that thought they were inventing immortality in the form of like a consciousness upload into the waters of Europa, essentially? And what they actually created was a nightmare escape where they're all trapped and unable to reach out. And so that's the post-apocalypse, and we are just injecting ourselves into it.
I love that.
That's really great.
And it will parallel the journey of the humans, which I think is important because we have this. I'm assuming we're on Europa to save ourselves, so it's a parallel to that, which will make it all work thematically.
Right. It's like finally we are ascending to a higher plane of consciousness. Like we've created this realm, and then they get there and it's nothing like they expected it to be, or maybe something happened in that moment, or this is actually not a bad idea. Maybe by breaching the ice or ignoring the sigils or not seeing the sigils, the humans have inadvertently caused this kind of nightmare hellscape, so they inadvertently created this problem, this apocalypse for the people of Europa.
We are the apocalypse. I like that a lot.
Oh yeah.
We've disrupted their systems. Yeah.
That is cool.
Can we have that be the title of the episode? We are the apocalypse, because that just sounds fucking cool.
That does sound pretty badass.
Yeah.
Well, I also have this image of like with this water, like that creates images of like tears and weeping, and so like the idea that like where these infections are happening in us, that like you have to beware the weeping ones.
Oh yeah,
yeah. That's a good phrase too.
Yeah, see,
I like that a lot. Yeah,
this is what happens when we have writers on the podcast. They have these turns of phrases, right?
There's a scene in the 2018 Suspiria movie that involves uncontrollable crying, and it leads to something fairly traumatic afterwards. And so I'm just picturing that in my head, that like these people, they can't even like wipe away the tears. They're just coming on so fast. And what do the people around them do in that situation?
Yeah, that is a great movie, by the way. Would recommend pretty much anyone watch it. Yeah. And with that very dour note, like on the downer note, we get to go out on the downer note this time, frankly. But I feel like that's a good place to end the world building jam. How do y'all feel about that?
I think we got a real nice setting going there. Yeah,
absolutely. And so, Justin, here's the thing. You've been on 3 times now, and normally we do like the rapid fire questions. We're frankly running out of questions for you at this point. So we're going to have to go. This is going to be an even quicker rapid fire question session. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Justin, who is your favorite fictional detective, and why is it Lieutenant Columbo?
Columbo is pretty great. I was actually just talking about Columbo and the fact that you know the solution to the mystery. Because I was actually talking about, all right, this is not a quick answer, but I was talking about how to do newspaper dramas in role-playing games, things like All the President's Men or Spotlight or Pelican Brief. And I realized that like All the President's Men and Spotlight, because they're based on true stories, that the expectation of those stories is that the audience knows the outcome. And how do you make a mystery story like that? Well, obviously Columbo did every week. You knew the solution to the mystery. And I think there's something interesting about that. Like relating back to role-playing games, like Brindlewood Bay is a great example of like how to experiment with the mystery genre. Favorite detective, though, I am going to go with Hercule Poirot.
Oh yeah, all right.
And it's because I actually played a not Hercule Poirot in an Agatha Christie play, so I have a close connection.
Nice.
Love it. Courtney, what's your rapid fire question?
Mine is the best use of an animal that you've seen in an RPG, like a familiar animal companion, etc.
I'm glad that you clarified, Courtney.
I had a player who had a animal companion, and they would cast gaseous form on them and have the animal companion drift through buildings as in gaseous form. And then use their connection to it as basically like a vapor-based spy cam that would just float through enemy compounds.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
Notes to ruin another campaign.
It's not ruining. It's like now all of a sudden you just have to find another way to make it interesting. For example, like we were saying, right? Like just because you know who murdered someone doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. It doesn't take away from
We'll see how my GM handles that.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, and if the GM is struggling with that kind of like advanced observation surveillance stuff, the raid scenario structure in So You Want to Be a Game Master will provide all they need for creating adventures for that.
Nice. Look at this man. This is how you do it, folks. All right, Daniel, what's your rapid fire question? What do we got?
Your most awkward or most amusing ruling as a GM.
Oh.
My brain may have broken on that one. Let me.
I'm always thinking, to give you time to think, I'm always thinking, like, for me, when I make a ruling that I've either fucked up or I thought it was kind of goofy, it sticks with me for a while. And I'm like, all right, how do I stop that from happening to me again? But sometimes the rulings are like just funny, and maybe they don't even know that it was an awkward ruling, you know?
Oh, where there's like inadvertent side or like consequences for that kind of ruling, that kind of thing.
Potentially, yeah. Or like you ruled in a way that like the players don't notice the problem, but it's clear it was a problem, and you want to make sure you correct it in the future.
Yeah, I'm sorry with that one. I can't think of any really great examples off the top of my head. One of the weirdest rulings I had to figure out how to do in a more robust way was off-target teleporting. Because in D&D, like you teleport spell, you can be off-target with it. And in that long-running D&D campaign I was talking about, the players actually put a lot of resources into getting their hands on a ring of teleportation so they could teleport everywhere. But the ring of teleportation could only teleport, I think, like 4 of them, and the party was larger than that, so they'd have to make multiple trips anytime they wanted to go somewhere, which is a great limitation that I have. So they could just like pop in and out easily. There had to be some strategic thinking to it. But the other thing, it means they were rolling the dice to see if they were off target on these teleportations a lot, because they roll it like 3 or 4 or 5 times, depending how many trips they had to make. Partly because of animal companions. To tie it back to that, like several of them have animal companions. So there was like the 5 or 6 PCs, depending on the point of the campaign, and then like 2 or 3 animal companions. So they'd have to make, like, say, multiple trips. So frequently they were off target, and I had to actually come up with a system for like figuring out a better way of like how they ended up off target. And I think probably the wackiest of those was when they ended up teleporting and going off target in such a way that they appeared several hundred feet above the city and were plummeting towards the ground, and then managed to activate a feather fall so they wouldn't hit the ground. But then I rolled a random encounter, and it was an adventurer with a dire bear. And so they ended up landing on top of this dire bear in the city street. So like they were like, let's head home. And then one of them was like, ah!
Nice.
Into a dire bear.
Wow.
I think that counts.
Yeah, I would definitely say so, for sure. And our final rapid fire question comes to us from one of our patrons, one Johnny Law, who asks, do you imbibe alcohol? And if so, what is your preferred poison?
That's a great question. I do imbibe alcohol. I very rarely drink when I am GMing, because I just need more focus than that when I'm GMing.
I'm with
but
you.
My number one alcohol of choice is a 15-year Glenfiddich Scotch.
Oh, let's go. Okay. No bullshit. That is literally what my grandmother used to drink. And that's not a dig on you at all. My grandmother had excellent taste, to the point where she was like in her 80s. Someone gave her a 10-year and she knew. And she's like, this is not right. You gave me a 10-year, not a 15. And I just want to say, great choice. Excellent choice there.
That your grandmother was obviously a woman of taste, because I also once got a 10-year Glenfiddich. I was like, this is not the same stuff. Like, it's not bad. It's just not the same stuff. They clearly do something different with their 10 years versus their 15 years.
It's clearly. Yeah.
I was going to guess you're either going to be a bourbon drinker or a Scotch drinker. So that makes sense to me.
And on that amazingly alcoholic note, I feel like that's a good place to end it. Justin, thank you so much for coming on. I am so excited to read your book. I've already got my copy pre-ordered. I know that Daniel probably does too. Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? We'll probably do a pre-order for Courtney as well, just to get her into it.
I've been telling people, like, if you are a forever GM, what you want to do is buy a copy for all of your players, because they will all become GMs and you'll be able to play.
The not so subtle hint of, listen here, motherfuckers, like, it's time. It's finally time.
No, I am really excited to check it out. Like I said, I've never run a game before, but it's something that I've been interested in, just have been sort of afraid to try it out, and really looking forward to checking out your steps to actually running a game.
Well, that's really exciting, and you'll have to let me know how it goes. Hopefully you'll find it to be the key that you need.
Absolutely. Now, so play us out here, Justin. Tell us the name of the book. Remind us the name of the book and when it will be available for purchase. And one more thing that I think is also very important. Where would you prefer people buy this book from? What helps you? What helps your local bookstore? All that good stuff. What do you prefer?
So You Want to Be a Game Master is coming out this November, and you will be able to find it in mainstream bookstores across the world. And you can pre-order it now. So you can go pre-order it this very instant. And what I've been telling people in terms of that is, if you're looking for what my preference is, it makes no difference to me where you buy it per se. So I recommend find a local bookstore, because that will both support that local bookstore, and it will also help spread word about this awesome book that's coming out. But the second best place is whatever works best for you, because the most important thing for me is that people get a copy of the book and are able to explore all of the cool things that I've packed into those pages.
Awesome. And Justin, where can people find you regularly on the internet?
The best place to find me is my website, The Alexandrian. That's thealexandrian.net. You can also find me on YouTube, though, also at The Alexandrian, where I do weekly-ish videos on advanced game mastering techniques, history of role-playing games, and that sort of thing. And from those places, you can find links to all my many post-Twitter social media accounts, and also my my Twitch channel as well, where I do live streams once a week with GMing advice.
Oh, nice.
Excellent. Justin, thank you again for joining us. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It is always wonderful to be here.
And we are back. That was, if my voice sounds a little hoarse, it's because we've been going for so long, but it was such a great conversation. Every time we have Justin on, it's always a great time. And I just wanted to let it breathe. We wanted to let it bloom like a beautiful wine in a decanter. And that's really how it felt. Y'all, I'm very excited for that book. I don't know about you.
Oh yeah. Like I said, I've thought about GMing for quite some time, but I'm always just too scared to dip my toe in the water. And this feels like a really, really great resource for just taking that final plunge.
Well, we've been asking, I remember the last time we had him on, or the first time, I was asking, like, when are we going to get this book? And clearly he's been working on it since before then, because he said 5 or 6 years,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually very excited for it as well. I would encourage all of our listeners here to go out and pre-order this book if you are a new GM or you haven't GM'd before, or if you, like Daniel and I, are ancient mummies and you've been DMing for a very long time. Please go out and pre-order this book. Give it a read. I'm so excited to get my hands on it. And like I said, even if you're not like a GM, like, hey, this is a great gift. If you want to get people into it, there's plenty of opportunities there.
The thing I can't stress enough too is, and granted we haven't seen the book, but I'm having read all of the material for the Alexandrian, is when he says like he's showing a step-by-step process, like he's not kidding. Like other resources I've read, they're very vague, or they're very tips based, which is also what he was saying in this interview. But what he gives, at least in the Alexandrian, is this central concept of node-based scenario design, which, like I don't know of it being really constructed in the same way that he talks about there anywhere else. But once you get that, everything else that you read in this book, depending on how it's structured, like spins out from that. And it really is the holy grail to understanding how to conduct it, right? Like without that, you're kind of just free falling. And I just, like, from my own personal experience, like, it is the solution. I can't be more of an advocate for this book, not having read it yet, because of the material I've seen on his website.
I can't wait until we get this book and it's just 500 crayon drawings of a dick butt. And we're just like gonna have to eat shit on this whole thing. But, like, no, I completely agree with Daniel that, like, in reality, like, we trust Justin, we trust his writing. Like, go out and buy it.
And I hate shilling I don't want to shill for anything, and I mostly hate everything. Like, to get a good review, like I'm telling you, like this. For me, this is like I got to buy 2 copies of this. It's like give one away. Always,
no, that's true. Daniel hates shit, and like I also don't feel like I feel comfortable shilling for stuff. I'm with you on that one. Like, this is completely genuine and like organic on our side. We are big fans. We wouldn't otherwise shill so hard for this, but still, that's going to do it for this episode of World Build with us, y'all. It's been a long one. Thanks for sticking with us. You know all the things that you got to do. Send us a world building prompt on our website, worldbuildwithus.com. Click the link, all that good stuff. And we'll be building it within a reasonable time frame. We're on YouTube. Go subscribe and do all the other stuff. We are on Twitter for some reason, @Let's World Build. We've got a Discord. And yes, in fact, we've got a Patreon if you want to go and support us directly. So if you want to do all that stuff, bam, you know where to go. You can help us out. We help you out. All that good stuff. That's going to do it for this episode of World Build with us. Remember that we love you very much. We're going to get through this together. Until next week.